Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm joined again by Mr. Jacobs. If you haven't heard his first few episodes, he's been on the show. He's been on a couple of times. Always a pleasure being able to speak with you. We've talked about the counterculture, talked about Vietnam, we've talked about deep state or military industrial complex, whichever word you want to use. And this discussion today is going to be about the Vietnam War. So while my hair is very long, I grew it out for this specific episode. But Mr. Jacobs, do you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Hi, yeah, my name's Ron Jacobs. I write for Counterpunch magazine online. It's online now, mostly, or at all. And I've written a few books, one on the Weather Underground, one on the counterculture, and then 60s counterculture in the 1970s. I'm working on another one now that is going to be a history of opposing U.S. imperialism from 1979 to the current time. Um, I'm about 10 years in. So when that comes out, maybe a year from now or something like that. But my focus has always been um, U.S. wars, U.S. military, and the protests and so on, the movements against them, especially since Vietnam, including Vietnam.
I wanted to get your opinion on the Vietnam War. Maybe you can give me a breakdown of obviously your perspective on it and how it maybe it's changed through the times.
Um, the Vietnam War was a war that the United States chose to get into. It had made promises to Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of the independence fighters. He was also a communist, but that's kind of secondary to the fact that he's kind of like the George Washington of Vietnam, if you want to make a comparison to U.S. history. Uh, and he was supported by the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which was a forerunner to the CIA during World War II to fight the Japanese, because Vietnam, Southeast Asia, what they used to call French Indochina at the time, because it was all French colonies, was a major front in the war on the Eastern Front. Japan went into China, they went into Singapore, they went into China, and they were in Korea as well. And the United States supplied Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, which was the liberation forces, the freedom fighters, uh, with weapons, logistics, etc., with the promise that when the war was over, they would get their freedom. The Vietnamese would get their freedom. But almost immediately after the war was over, Roosevelt died in the meantime. Henry Wallace, who was one of the most progressive vice presidents, if not just public officials ever in the United States, had been pushed out of the administration, and Harry Truman had become president. And Truman was more of a Cold Warrior type of guy. And so everything that had any taint of socialism or communism in it, which the Vietnamese, which most independence forces did, especially immediately after World War II, because communism and socialism was a pretty strong force and popular force in the world up until fairly recently, actually. But anyhow, so France wanted to take its colonies back in Indochina and in Africa and so on. And France had a war going on in Algeria against the liberation forces there. But then it also had a war going on in Vietnam against the liberation forces there. The United States supported the French colonial forces, giving them um, arms, logistical support, advisors, intelligence, all the kind of stuff the United States does when they um, are fighting basically proxy wars. Uh, the Vietnamese defeated the French very soundly in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, 1953 actually. And so then the United Nations stepped in, and there was peace. There was a bunch of talks, and ultimately what happened was the country of Vietnam was split into two. Uh, North Vietnam, with the capital of Hanoi, that was Vietnamese, and that was controlled by the independence forces under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. Then Southern Vietnam became South Vietnam, and its capital was in Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City. And that was ruled by a series of what I call puppet governments installed by the United States under the facade of democracy. And at first, the U.S. was just sending in what they called advisors, and this was under Eisenhower. And then when Kennedy came into power in 1961, when he was inaugurated, um, the history to me is still unclear because there were many elements in the Kennedy administration that did not want what they called overseas adventures on the scale of what Vietnam ultimately became. There are other people who say that Kennedy, I mean, he was a Cold Warrior, I mean, and was doing the stuff over in Europe with the Berlin Wall and all that kind of so on, and NATO, etc. But he, but anyhow, who knows what exactly the story is? By 19, when Kennedy was killed in November 1963, uh, Johnson obviously became president, and he ran in the '64 campaign. Vietnam was just starting to get on the what would you call it, in the news, and it was starting to get on the wavelength of some U.S. residents, U.S. citizens, and so on, especially among college students and in the military, obviously. Um, but still, there weren't a lot of troops, relatively speaking, maybe 10,000 at the most, and mostly there's a lot of CIA, and the CIA was doing its thing, trying to set up something in between the ultra right Catholic government in Saigon and the communist government in Hanoi. They wanted to set up a third so-called democratic capitalist force, which is a standard CIA pretense. Um, Anyhow, so what happened was um, LBJ ran on a peace campaign, and his opponent from the Republican Party was Barry Goldwater, who was probably he was a John Bircher. He was probably the beginning of what we now see the Republican Party as an ultra right, almost fascist organization um, that has support of a fair number of people. And so um, LBJ ran on a peace platform and kind of painted Barry Goldwater as if he comes in, he's going to drop the nuke on Vietnam and who knows where else. So LBJ won soundly in August 1964. Let's see, that means he had been inaugurated in January. Yeah, this was before he actually got the inauguration. But in August 1964, there was a incident that was contrived by the United States called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. They had been U.S. Navy boats in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam, um, firing, whatever, big big armaments into various National Liberation Force and North Vietnamese old bases, installations, whatever you want to call them. And so ultimately, they got attacked back. The Americans got attacked, and they used that. LBJ used that as a reason to ask Congress to give him power to respond. And basically, what happened, the resolution that Congress passed, and it was almost unanimous. There was a few senators and a few Congress people from both parties, because that's back when the Republican Party still had liberals and the Democratic Party still had people who were anti-war. Um, they and the resolution basically gave the president full power to do whatever he felt was necessary. So that's when the arms buildup began and more troops started getting sent over to Vietnam. By 1968, there was a 500,000 troops in Vietnam with that, a constant number with, troops coming in, troops leaving, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, there was a lot of Navy off the coast. They had a few aircraft carriers that would launch planes to do bombing raids and so on. So as it went on, and then in 68, 68 was the worst year for the U.S. forces in Vietnam. Like hundreds of men were dying every week. Every week, the newscasts every day they would, like CBS, NBC, they would have photos of the men who had been killed either that day, or some of them would just have at the end of the week they would have photos of like 150, 200 troops who had been killed in Vietnam. And student groups had been opposing the Vietnam War in greater and greater numbers. It started off with small protests on college campuses, mostly led by Marxist groups. Um, and the Students for Democratic Society were just starting to get involved in that. And then some African American groups that were also Marxist oriented. Um, but by 1968, there had been several large demonstrations, and they had started to get rowdier, especially, for an example, in October 20th, the weekend of October 21st, 1967, there was a massive protest in Washington, D.C., and after the protest, tens of thousands of protesters marched across the bridge over to the Pentagon into Virginia, and there was a major confrontation at the Pentagon between National Guard troops, cops, and protesters. One of the best books written on that, in my opinion, is by Norman Mailer. It's called Armies of the Night. It's a journal, what do they call it? New journalist piece, basically. It started off as a one whole Harper's magazine, and they turned it into a book. It ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize. And so it's a wonderful and a really descriptive book if you wanted to know what it felt like to be in a protest like that. Uh, on March 31st, 1968, the campaign for president, the nominations were in full swing. Eugene McCarthy was an anti-war candidate in the Democratic Party. He was kind of a libertarian more than anything else. He won, and this is when the primaries really mattered in the presidential campaigns for both parties. And in New Hampshire was the first primary at the time. Iowa didn't exist, the Iowa caucuses. And so he won with 30, well, he didn't win, but he got 32% of the vote. And LBJ only got like a few more points than that. So that was a real wake up call as to how many, at least Democrat voters, were opposed to the war.
Well, LBJ
And
already
so
stated he probably wasn't going to run again, right? He wasn't
it
really.
was it was it was right after that, because the what do you call it was in the primary was in early March, and on March 31st, 1968, he gave a speech to the nation where two things. He announced that he was going to have a bombing pause. They were going to stop bombing North Vietnam, in hopes that it would move to the peace talks had started in 1960, excuse me, 1967, but they hadn't really gone anywhere. They were still discussing who was going to sit on what side of the table. They were taking place in Paris. Uh, but so he announced a bombing halt for, I think it was 30 or 60 days, to give to prove that the United States was genuine in its desire for peace. And then at the very end of the speech, this was a nationally broadcast speech. I remember listening to it with my father in the car, driving home from something, and he said, "I will not," and basically he said he would not accept, nor would he try to gain the nomination for the Democratic Party for president. So that threw the race wide open. Bobby Kennedy jumped right in as another anti-war candidate, and Hubert Humphrey. Ultimately, Bobby Kennedy was killed. Eugene McCarthy did not win the nomination. The anti-war plank at the convention was kicked out. The convention turned into a major police riot, where protesters and police fought in the streets. It was all over the TV. The coverage was incredible for that time period. And Hubert Humphrey, who had been LBJ's vice president, was nominated kind of like through backroom deals and so on to become president of the United States. He almost beat Richard Nixon, who was the Republican candidate, and Nixon was running on this campaign as regards to Vietnam. His campaign slogan was that he had a secret peace plan to end the war. As it turned out, in 1969, when he got nominated, obviously in January 1969, and basically his peace plan was to escalate the war and to threaten to drop nukes on Vietnam. But the protests got bigger. I mean, they became more mainstream than they ever had been. Two of the biggest protests were in October and in November of 1969, and they were protests that the first one in October 15th, there was a big one in Washington, D.C., a big one in New York, and then in L.A. and San Francisco. But the more important part about those protests was they took place in thousands of towns and villages and small cities around the United States. And they were more, instead of just being students and long hair freaks and African American freedom fighters and so on, they were middle America. The town where I lived in, I was a freshman in high school. The town where I lived in, was going to Catholic school at the time. The nuns had organized teach-in for the whole day. And then after that, we joined a protest in the little main street in this town, which is midway between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And there was maybe like 30, 40 people there, some college students, some some people who lived in the neighborhood, and some high school students like me. And what we did is we read the names of the American soldiers who had been killed over in Vietnam. Um, and that went on throughout the country. And then in November 15th, it was a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C., somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million. It's hard, crowd estimates. It depends on who's giving them. And they weren't as good at it as they are now because didn't have the technology. And then the other big protest was in San Francisco, where it was a couple 100,000 people. And that basically, it scared Nixon. And according to Henry Kissinger, that's when Nixon backed off the idea of nuking Vietnam. And that's when they began they stepped up the negotiations going on in Paris, but it would still be another 4 years and another million Vietnamese and another 25, 30,000 US soldiers dead in Vietnam, and a lot more protests until about 1972, when it became end of 1972, when the peace treaty was almost signed. And the peace treaty was signed in January 1973, and the war, and that's when all U.S. troops, the only U.S. elements in there at the time were CIA and mercenaries, and a lot of the Air Force was still bombing, but they were not on in Vietnam. The planes were coming from Okinawa, Japan, different places, the Philippines, and so on, and doing their bombing runs, and then going back to their home air base.
What would you say was the biggest impact to stopping the Vietnam War? Would you say it was the battle on the home front? The fact that it seemed like at this point we had so much being spent into focusing on domestic issues. Hoover seemed like he had that on lock, and then by the time Nixon's administration is going through things, the war is on the home front. You cannot avoid looking at Vietnam War now. Before, people were okay with the Vietnam War, didn't care about it because they couldn't see it. Much like a lot of problems, people don't tend to care about it if it's not in their backyard. And then it was finally brought at home, and it seemed like all the protests and the violence that was going on, it became too much for any of the administration to really handle. And it seemed like it's just always been weird to me with the Vietnam War that when you ask people about it, they're all rejecting the Vietnam War. Like they all think it's a bad idea. And then depending on what generation you're in is who you blame. LBJ seems to be the large focus when people think of Vietnam. And rightfully so. He did cover a lot of years, especially after Kennedy. But at the same time, like we think of Nixon, we think of Watergate. A lot of people don't think of Vietnam with Nixon. At least my generation doesn't. We're largely disconnected from the Vietnam War. But we always just think Watergate. It was like, well, that controls information on Vietnam and other things as well, too. But it's just they think of a whole other thing, war on drugs. A bunch of other crap comes to mind when they think of Nixon. He was a liar. He drooled a lot, like these types of things. With LBJ, he's brass, like he's got a harsh attitude, Johnson treatment style things, and then it's the Vietnam War. That was the thing that we should remember about Johnson. It's like I don't know how much of it was. He did do a lot, but is this also a problem of people in the administration feeding false information? Because the more I hear of LBJ's phone calls and people telling Johnson we're doing good over there and we can't back down or we're going to look like we're retreating and that's not good for the look of America and the power that we have, where I'm sitting there like, I don't know. Again, it's context of the times might be a little bit different. I don't think LBJ is a saint at all, but I start going, we should blame more than just LBJ for this whole masterpiece.
Um, LBJ, I honestly believe, yeah, he was responsible for the escalation of the war, but I think he should be remembered more for the programs like Medicare and the Great Society programs and what they used to call aid to families with dependent children, welfare, whatever, and all the civil rights stuff that he passed. He was able to do that, but and he knew that his legacy by 1968, he knew that his legacy would be Vietnam instead of those programs. And ultimately, the Vietnam War, because it costs so much money, because war always costs a lot of money to the people that are fighting it, at the same time that the people who are arming it are making gross, disgusting amounts of money off of killing. And LBJ, it's hard to describe in today's world, but like growing up, like in the 60s and the 50s and the 60s and before that, America's wars were always like good wars, right? And it took a long time to convince. Like my father was in the military; he was an officer in the Air Force. He spent a year and a half in Vietnam, um, and he was in the military for 30 years. He didn't get out till 1979, uh, and he was a true believer, and he thought that what the United States, he thought stopping communism was crucial to saving American democracy or whatever. As he got older, after he retired and like in his when he got into like his 50s, 60s, and so on, he started reading some of the books I had recommended to him when I was in high school and in college that he didn't want to have anything to do with. And he started to realize, like, maybe we were on the wrong side in Vietnam. Maybe we should have kept our promise to Ho Chi Minh and it would have turned out completely different. And it's kind of ironic because if you look at it now, we're trading partners with Vietnam. Uh, there's U.S. companies over there, like, basically exploiting labor where like they do anywhere else. The difference is in Vietnam, like in China, at least they have health insurance and housing and everything because the government is sort of socialist. You know what I mean? Um, People aren't left on their own for basic needs and education stuff. But anyhow, LBJ gets blamed for it, and LBJ was very instrumental in escalating it. But I agree with you that part of it was related to the information he was getting. Robert McNamara, in my mind, is one of the biggest war criminals.
All right, there we go. Let's get into that because he's a Kennedy guy. I'm with the Kennedy thing you mentioned this at the beginning. I wanted to kind of mention it when you said it, but it's it's unknown what Kennedy would have done.
Right,
There's
exactly.
NASAM 63, I think it's called, that was apparently signed, and it was given a word that Kennedy was willing to pull troops out. It just never happened. I haven't found a signature on the paper to be able to prove it, so it's word of mouth, of depending on who you take it from. But there's phone calls with LBJ talking to Robert McNamara. Like you and Kennedy were the ones that were like, doing this and doing that, and then he's yelling at McNamara for the situation that he's getting blamed for when it comes to Vietnam. Now, I think Kennedy was going to pull troops out. I do think that. But again, we just have to follow the historical record here, which is just stating that it was going to be this. Now we have statements from like John McCone, who was director of the CIA, that stated he talked to Kennedy, and Kennedy had said he was going to reduce the level of presence in Vietnam to level back to Eisenhower's administration, which honestly seems probably the most accurate.
Yeah,
Um,
have advisors and stuff. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, but George Reedy in an interview stated that when LBJ came into office, he looked at the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration looked at the Johnson administration on wondering what to do with Vietnam. And he said, well, Kennedy was already putting more troops in Vietnam, so I'm going to continue what the Kennedy administration is doing. And that's what George Reedy thought Johnson was taking the thing for, was just looking at that. And you got to understand, JFK didn't trust anybody in office. He trusted his brother, really, is only the only person, maybe like
Yep.
one other person. And
Who
did he
was
ever
mortal enemies with LBJ?
yeah. So did he ever give any opinion on what he was doing in Vietnam? Did
Yeah, yeah.
LBJ ever sit him
RFK
down
and
and be like,
LBJ just they had no use for each other.
so there's never really a sit down of LBJ and JFK talking
Right.
about like, hey,
Yeah.
what's going on in Vietnam? There was never that. So he just has to assume I saw him pull troops in. That was the last thing he did. I have to continue that. A lot of Johnson's things that he does with civil rights, all these things, he's not doing it out of the kindness of his heart. It's looking really good on him to get people on Kennedy's administration on his side because he's continuing things that Kennedy was in the process of doing. It's difficult because if you're part of the JFK research community or you look into his assassination, one name that everyone mentions as a person that they're all like, he was a main dissenter of the Warren Commission, Richard Russell. He refused to serve on the Warren Commission
Uh-huh,
multiple
uh-huh.
times. He was best friends with LBJ. They called each other like 12 times a day. Like it was just a ridiculous number of times. But Richard Russell's in an interview with Face the Nation talking about the Vietnam War, and he's just tossing out money. It's going to cost another $1 billion. We're spending 2.5 million over there. One of those choppers gets shot down. I'm not even talking about the big ones. I'm talking about the small ones. That's 12.5 million right there. You're going to have more people go over there. I estimate a total of 600,000 people dead by 66. And he's just literally stating these things like it's fine. And he's talking about like escalating. He's talking about what we need to do. We're not going to retreat. And he's doing all this. And it's like, if LBJ has that in his ear, what's going to happen? I mean, there's military forces. Now, sorry for the tangent. I wanted to get to McNamara here because it's interesting to me to reveal you see one side of people through one side of the administration. You get to the other administration, you see a completely different side of these people, which makes you even regret either hating them or liking them in the first place.
Robert McNamara was a technocrat. He's like what T.S. Eliot would call a hollow man, in my opinion. And he had been like way up in the Ford company, Ford, some kind of big bureaucrat and stuff like that. He was really good with making soulless decisions, let's say. He got hired, I think he started in the Kennedy administration, but he was crucial to the Vietnam War. And he he would collect data because that's what they do. He collected a lot of data and he listened to the war machine, like Lockheed and all those companies that make money off of war. And that's what people never really talk about. Those people are key drivers in any U.S. war or in any country. The war industry in any country is what pushes countries towards war a lot because they know there's a lot of money to be made, and they don't really care about the human cost. But he McNamara was kind of one of the main advisors about the war, and then the other one was General Westmoreland. Um, and General Westmoreland we used to call him General Wastemoreland, but he was a very, he thought the Vietnam War could be won. And that was, I think, the biggest mistake that anybody in power in the United States who was involved in power and involved with the war in Vietnam believed was that they could beat a people that wanted its independence and its freedom and so on, and they just didn't understand that they were willing to that the Vietnamese were willing to fight for another generation or two since they'd already been fighting for a couple of generations to throw off the colonial yoke and all that kind of stuff. Um,
Who's the statement of the guy who talked about going over there and seeing a child pick up a gun and he's gonna like, oh, they're gonna fight to have the women and children fight, like they're
yeah,
gonna
I
go
know
down
what.
to
Yeah,
the
yeah,
last
yeah.
bone.
Yep, yep. I mean, I don't want to go off the subject here, but I think at the same time, this is what we're seeing in Palestine.
Or even Iraq was another issue
Yeah,
as well too.
those people, they don't like when you're been occupied by people. You don't want you want your freedom. It becomes very crucial. McNamara went on. He ultimately left um, when LBJ left, and he went on to become like a big guy in the World Bank, doing the same kind of stuff, manipulating economies that at the expense of the poor and the working people around the world for the benefit of big business and so on. There's a biography. He made a movie, there's a movie about him. I can't remember the name of it now. Something, The Fog of War. It's a good movie about McNamara. He never expressed too much regret. I mean, a lot of people who were involved in Vietnam at different levels, whether they were GIs in the jungle or in the back loading the planes, or whether they were officers like my father, or whether they were higher up, like in the general ranks and so on, and the bureaucrats who were involved in stuff. A lot of them, once they had time to reflect, expressed regret for what they were involved in, even if they don't think they did anything like morally wrong. I think most of them wrestled with that the rest of their life. I know my father did, but McNamara was just. It's hard, he's soulless is the best word I can come up with him. But he was crucial in getting LBJ's ear, and there was a couple other guys. Dean Rusk was another one. Um, like I already said, Westmoreland, and then there was the folks like you're talking about, Richard Russell. There was quite a few of those in Congress, and a lot of them were like Southern senators and Congress people.
Abe Fortas is another example
Yeah, yeah.
on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, Senator Eastland from
James Eastland.
Mississippi. Yeah, and there's a variety of those folks, and everybody when they read, a lot of people now when they read history and or present it, when they're talking about it casually, they act like everybody was against the Vietnam War from the beginning, the Americans and half of the Congress and stuff. That's not true. I mean, this, but like it didn't really change until, like you said, it was the protests. And a lot of people agreed with at least some parts of what the protesters were saying, even if they didn't like the more radical elements that were like, throwing rocks and fighting with the cops and, setting off bombs and all that kind of stuff, which is what it is. Um, but they at least agreed, yeah, we need to get, and part of they agreed that the war needed to end and the U.S. needed to pull out all of its troops. And part of it was because the tactic of, I would say, by 1969, 1970, I would say one of the tactical approaches by probably about 25 to 35% of the protesters, was to make the country ungovernable, make it so that people couldn't go about their daily lives as long as the United States was involved in the war over there and was killing people and sending troops over there. And it's hard to say whether or not it was effective. I personally believe it was effective, but in terms of actually the reason the Vietnam War ended the way it did was it was because of the Vietnamese. But like the National Liberation Forces, were always very grateful to the protests in the United States and around the world because they understood that when you're fighting at such an asymmetrical war, I mean, you have these peasants, basically a peasant army, well trained, and very used to combat, and who were being armed on some levels by both the Soviets and the Chinese. But they weren't. I mean, North Vietnam had airplanes, but all the people in the southern part of Vietnam, the National Liberation Front, they were using rifles and booby traps. They were using it very kind of like as you to go like to Iraq with the IEDs and stuff like that. They didn't, and or Palestine where they don't have an air force, et cetera, et cetera. When they're getting bombed every day, and the Vietnamese people were getting bombed constantly. Um, so I lost my train of thought, but so they
Well, you brought up a lot of good points. I wanted to kind of mention, do you think that a lot of the counterculture movements that followed kind of copied the template of the anti-Vietnam stance of the counterculture movement? There's what those protests were doing. It seems like a lot of people just extended that into other things, such as like equal rights or civil rights issues and other things of dealing with like Black Panthers and just talking about like just anti-government stuff, whether it's against the Federal Reserve or anything that the counterculture was really going against. It seems like it all kind of started, the main template was modeled off the Vietnam War protests. It seems like that was kind of a forerunner for the whole thing and exploded the counterculture movement where people just extended it to other things.
yeah, I think the, the movements that cut where the counterculture kind of like came out of or glommed into or whatever were the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And I think for most white young people in the United States, the anti it was the war that was the key thing because every young man could get drafted, and like they went after poor people, like poor African Americans and poor white people first because the draft was until 1969 or till 70 when they started the lottery. It was geared to go after the poor, the working people, the poor working people first, and college students and people who had connections in other ways could get uh, exemptions until they were too old to get drafted. And I think that made the anti-war movement because it affected a very important movement for people who were just kind of dropping out or just trying to be kids for as long as they could. And with the counterculture going on, that brought up a whole new way. You didn't have to go get a job right away. You could go hang out in some hippie ghetto and party and do other stuff, do your art, just get high, whatever you wanted to do, hang out with your friends, travel around. But with the threat of the draft hanging over young men, every young man, it did get some of the anti-war organizers like Abby Hoffman, and some of the other yippies and a lot of people who were attracted to both the and SDS. They saw that we can organize these people and that will make our movement even bigger, and it did. I mean, it made it very very big, you know, enough to make a difference.
There's a phone call with Robert McNamara and LBJ where he's talking to McNamara and he's like, "What do you care? You're going to train these men for 18 years, and what are they going to do? They're going to go over there and put their gun down. Then what do you got? Are you going to go pick up a gun and go over there?" Like he's yelling at McNamara because he's kind of going with LBJ on the go, escalating in Vietnam, even though he was the opposite with Kennedy apparently. But he was literally stating like, if these counterculture movements getting this big and people are going to stop fighting, then what are you going to do? What are you military people going to do? These people that are pushing for it, are you guys going to go over there and fight? And to me, it was just interesting because I think LBJ, we all know, was not a person to railroad or try and railroad. And it was just funny to see LBJ catch it and kind of notice when someone was trying to do it to him and him just flip it around on them like, this is not how this goes. I'm the president. But I also think that he realized that for the first year or so, he was just taking advice from people and just doing what they said and escalating and doing whatever they said. Oh, we're winning. Okay, I'll just toss more troops in. Because he was so focused in 63, 64, and then even some of 65 with just JFK stuff, where I was like, he's getting blamed for the assassination. Manchester's book comes out, writes all these horrible things about him. Everything was a press battle. What do I say about this whole type of thing? And it really wasn't talking about the Vietnam that much. There were a couple phone calls, but it was largely just focused on like, what do you need? All right, I'll send that over there, and then just not paying attention. So when we get into these types of discussions about Vietnam, I think it's important the counterculture gets brought up because the counterculture was just one thing that I don't think it had ever really been seen before. I mean, then we get the release of the Pentagon Papers, and then everyone's kind of paying attention to what the hell's going on. We're not winning at all. You've been lying to us this whole time. And that, I think, is the Vietnam War is the best example of exposing what a deep state or military industrial complex is. Not the Kennedy assassination. That's if you want to go really deep and just, it's not as connected. The Vietnam War was proven that there were external forces and people involved in high positions of power that were either avoiding information or dissenting wrong information to people in positions that were calling the shots. That was a big thing with the church committee. Again, those names, I'm sure that name list goes very, very long, and a lot of people are probably tacked onto that list. But it was something where a lot of people realized that they had been either being lied to or they were told one thing and then now they're seeing photos of a person running through the street like the naked girl half burned alive with napalm. And they're like, what the hell are we even doing over there? And you had literally a cultural kind of pullback of we need to get out of there. None of us agree with being over there. And this becomes a stain that gets blamed on someone. And that's kind of like what I was talking about earlier. Nixon, I feel like, should get a lot more of that blame.
I
There's a
agree.
there's a phone call with, and I was a Nixon fan. I did think he got targeted in Watergate. I don't think he's the sole provider of this whole thing. I think there's a lot of other forces that just toss Nixon with the ship. Um, but in the phone call with LBJ and Nixon, he states to him, are you going and talking about Vietnam? Like this is like in 68, like right before the thing's about to happen again. And LBJ is probably not running again. He's talking to him. He's like, are you making statements about Vietnam? Right. And he's like, he said something. Nixon's kind of stuttering through his words. And he goes, did you talk about that you possibly had a peace treaty with South Vietnam or whatever? And you're going to delay that until you get your, and it was like mentioned on the phone. And I'm like, is that true? Is that a real thing that Nixon was going to delay a peace treaty until he was elected to get the rap for creating a peace talk with something in Vietnam? And again, that's why I say Nixon needs to get looked at a little bit more.
Yeah, I've always thought that Nixon was responsible for, and the people he represented was responsible. I mean, I think the war could have basically the peace terms that the U.S. reached with the North Vietnam, with Hanoi, and with the National Liberation Forces in southern Vietnam. The peace treaty that they signed in January 1973 was essentially the same treaty that the Vietnamese were presenting at the table in 1969, in the summer and the fall of 1969. And Nixon said, Nixon still insisted, him and Kissinger and whoever else was advising, but Kissinger was crucial in that. They still believed that they could win the war, just send more troops in, and they were just going to ignore the protests, and they ignored the protests as long as they could, but ultimately they couldn't ignore them anymore, and they couldn't ignore the fact that they were losing support among the so-called silent majority, which was Nixon's big, these white middle class America go to work, they respect the police, la di da di da, but they but I agree with you about Nixon, and I also think that
And again, we've talked about Nixon. I've defended him, but looking more at like again, when you examine the administrations in particular, like kind of secluded away these events and look at them one by one, you kind of put a not a balanced perspective, but of I don't really like him and I don't really hate him. It's just I don't know what he was thinking. And again, Nixon's a Boy Scout of the government. Everything he was going to do exactly what they said. If they put out a dick, he'd say how hard do you want me to sit on it? Like that's Nixon for you. And sadly, he didn't really get a backbone until after LBJ died and like all these huge power figures died. Then he felt like he was a big fish in the pond. But it was just interesting to me. There was a conversation between LBJ and Richard Helms. Now, LBJ put Richard Helms in the CIA director position, and then he retired, and then he was the CIA director for Nixon's administration. He has a phone call with him. He goes, I need you just in case any press come to my ranch and ask me questions, I need you to keep me informed, like I did for Eisenhower and like I did for Truman. That is illegal. These people are no longer president. They do not get the information that's going on behind the scenes. But Richard Helms said he promised to do so. But LBJ said, but make sure you get the go ahead from Nixon to do so, because it would be like coming onto someone's land and not asking for their permission first. And it's just, it was eye opening, because I think we all know that's going on, that there's secrets being shared. People are getting information when they shouldn't be, even though they're not involved in whatever agency or department that's, the information's coming from. But this was a phone call of LBJ telling Richard Helms that he needs to do his duty as an American and do what has been unspoken and what we've all done, and inform the prior presidents who are no longer president, in case a press person comes up, they're informed on the issue. And to me, it was just like this eye-opening thing of like, man, you guys had so many connections into the White House. You could have easily gave an opinion or some type of perspective change, but you saved it for like a one-off in a newspaper, like Truman talking about Dag Hammarskjöld, just one-offs it in a newspaper. I'm like, where were you then?
Right, right, right. To go back to that secret peace plan, that it's never been proven, but yeah, it was in the news a couple of years ago when some Nixon papers were released, or some papers having to do with that period of time, and supposedly Kissinger was trying to conduct backdoor negotiations and so on, but apparently they didn't really go anywhere. It's not anything new either. Like if you look at, like, to jump ahead, that's what Reagan did, um, with the hostages in Iran. He his people made promises to the Ayatollah that they would get the parts for the weapons that were U.S. weapons that had been cut off after the revolution, and basically, so the day that, and as long as the Ayatollah refused to negotiate with Carter, and then the day that Nixon is giving his inaugural speech, the next thing they announce is that the hostages had been released. And then if you look at, like, recently, um, stuff that went on, during the most recent election, Trump had his people going over to Israel and to Gaza, well, over to Israel and negotiating with the Israelis, and putting out feelers to the Hamas people in Qatar and so on. And legally, that's illegal as can be, because they're private citizens. You're not supposed to do that. But like you said, they have this whole network, and they kind of operate where they're at this a level higher than the rest of the people in the country. My father worked for NSA, National Security Agency, and he said that him and we would have like debates pretty much every night about the war and about other stuff. But
Well,
he would always,
to him, you're just a young kid with a strong heart, which is like a liberal in general. And then when you get older, you become more conservative in your stances on things.
that's what they say. I don't think I ever did, but yeah, they but he would always say, if there's stuff, he says, there's stuff I know, I wish I could tell you. But as he got older and he got further and further away from from that time period in his life, he would like start to tell me stories about. He goes, yeah, he said, I would see some of this stuff crossing my desk, because they intercept messages. That's what NSA does. And it's all about, now they do it through computers, but back then their computer was like much clunkier than the ones they have now, obviously. But he said he would see messages come across his desk that he would have to sign off on and forward and decide whether they went up the chain or whether they stopped at his desk. So there's a lot of stuff that now, when I look back on it, was of questionable character. He said, I don't think those people should have either had that information, because obviously they got that information illegally, he said, or they should not have been discussing this stuff with the people they were discussing it with. And he said the thing that became the clearest during his years of service was that the military industrial complex played a much larger role than anybody ever assumed. And he goes, especially me. He said, I didn't really get it till the last 5 or 6 years of his job, when he started seeing men that he had worked with who were that much older than him, so they had been in the service like 4 or 5 years longer, and they were starting to leave the service, and they were getting recruited by like Lockheed Martin and all these big things. And my father, this is, I'm not bragging about him, but he said that when he was really tempted to blow the whistle on it, and he was about a year away from his full retirement, 30 years or whatever, and the guy who had been his mentor all through his time in the military after he was whatever, after he got out of ROTC and he was active, he went on active duty. Um, he said that because he had like the evidence right there. He was going to release it to the newspaper or something. And he said that the guy who had been his mentor his entire life said, "Don't do it, because if you do it, they will take away all your retirement, and they will run your name through the mud." So he still had a bunch of kids at home. So he had a family to take care of. So he said, I made that decision. He said, I wondered whether I made the right decision my entire life, because he said, and that was just like one small instance, but he said that's when it really came home to me, like, is that these decisions aren't necessarily based on honest political decisions. They're based on money, much more than we want to think that it is.
Even besides, like you hear LBJ talking phone call deals with Harold Byrd and military contracts for airplanes that went up after Kennedy died, which is why people suspect he had some type. Everybody benefited when Kennedy died. I hate to say it like that, but there's a lot of names that I could list off. But there's people that were involved that were just agreeing with LBJ and supporting whatever direction they thought he wanted to go in. So if LBJ is given a phone call, next thing you know, this person that might not even agree with the stance of increasing involvement in Vietnam just wants to say yes because it's LBJ on the phone.
Yeah, he's the president. He's a commander. Yeah,
There,
yeah,
there
yeah.
wasn't a whole lot of people in his administration or Kennedy's administration that were giving him any bit of disagreement or saying that's a stupid idea. The only one was Richard Russell, but he supported the Vietnam War.
And he was so far on the right in the pro-war side as opposed to
Well,
the
he was
opposite.
running like the
Yeah.
Senate and then the CIA had all this information on them, and that's why LBJ wanted him on the commission so badly for JFK's assassination because he wanted those things controlled and not independent investigations going on. But most of the military industrial complex things that we've kind of alluded to already, they're hardcore right wingers or military patriots that just want to show and probably after a while of shovel and shit, you're bound to eat a few. And they bought their own propaganda. They
Yeah,
wanted,
I
they
agree.
thought, they
Yeah.
were honest. Like Richard Russell gave on that Face the Nation interview, said something about a guy named Maxwell Taylor, General
Oh yeah,
Maxwell
yeah.
Taylor.
General Maxwell Taylor. Yeah.
He talked about, General Maxwell Taylor, he came on there kind of talking like a drunk uncle on the news and everybody's giving him crap for. But I was impressed by that DM coup that he did. And, we're over there in Vietnam. He's pulling, 2 to 3 different types of coups a week. And, I'm pretty impressed by that. I think that's the right direction to be heading in. I'm like, did he just admit to saying that we're doing different types of coups in Vietnam and he's accepting that as like that's a proper strategy to handle the Vietnam over there? So again, these are things in historical context. You bring it to today's time, looks really bad. But back then, he's tossing it out on Face the Nation, and they're more worried about the budget. People asking him questions. Tell me about the budget. Tell us what you think Johnson's going to be doing. Have you voiced your concern about wanting more political involvement in Vietnam? Have you talked to LBJ about that? And he's like, I'm not going to tell you what I talked to the president about. I don't say it on the floor of the Congress, and I sure as hell ain't going to say it here on this news. So he's just that type of person, that mentality, filling up most of the government. You can understand how Vietnam could get so bad. We never have people that are bringing up opposing views. I think as important. Even when Hubert Humphrey ran, LBJ was telling people that don't make sure Humphrey doesn't go up there and start tossing out certain things about Vietnam and saying stupid stuff and using things this because at this point he's trying to recover whatever legacy he's going to have. And right now, it's all about Vietnam. And if Humphrey goes out there and starts talking about a bunch of talking points that Johnson's administration was doing, it's going to only backfire in his face. And again, these are situations where, again, I don't know if Humphrey would have did a better job. I don't know if anybody would have done a better job. I think at that point in the situation, Nixon took the hit for it and he made it worse on the way down. But could it have been worse without Nixon? I don't know.
I think that I still like to think this is that if Humphrey had won, I think he would have reversed the war. And because I think but he was basically LBJ's clone during the campaign, and he was only in that campaign from the end of the convention in July or August, whenever it was, until the election. I heard him speak a couple of times. I was like 13 or 14. I heard Humphrey speak a couple of times, um, and he when he spoke at University of Maryland, he mentioned that he was going to end the war before within the next year or something like that. But when he spoke out in the town where I lived with my parents, which was a town right next to a military base, he didn't talk about the war at all. He just talked about our soldiers, and the stuff the politicians always say about the hard work that our soldiers are doing and the risks they're taking and so on. And he was basically doing that for the military families in the audience because they were mostly for Nixon, because Nixon was saying, we're going to win this war. I have a secret peace plan, but I'm also willing to do what it takes to win, you know. Uh, so, like you said, we won't know, and who knows? Maybe our kids will know if that information, if there's that information is out there still. Then,
I want to retract what I said about not knowing who would have been better than Nixon. RFK would have been. RFK, if he would have won that position, I feel like we would have been out of Vietnam a hell of a lot sooner.
and that's interesting. Like I agree with you. And I think RFK actually probably could have won the election if he had made it to he would have got the nomination and he would have won the election because enough people on the left, even in the student left, could have been convinced to support him, and he appealed to people like my father. My father was very conservative. He was a Republican, never voted for a Democrat until Obama. Um, and that's because he didn't like John McCain. He didn't trust John McCain. He knew him personally, so he didn't trust him. He thought it was, he said the POW camp really ruined his ability to think, but I remember my father saying that he's like I could have voted for RFK because he had a way of bringing people together and he believed in taking care of the poor. And it's that Catholic thing, I guess, but
There's an interview of John McCone, that same one where he mentioned the troop involvement with JFK. He mentions about RFK. He said Bobby was like a conservative. He was a hardcore, not hardcore, but he was a hard conservative. And a little bit different than his brother, who was a little bit more liberalish on some of his tendencies. But the way that Bobby's mentality was, he only gave compliments to Bobby. John McCone did. But then when he talked about Johnson, he was like, Johnson wasn't a good president. He was a good politician.
yes, that's a good way of, yeah, that's really good. He was known for that. I mean, one of the ways he got and I mean, I wish more Democratic politicians in today's world had that same kind of like what ability to do what he did. I mean, he used threats and he used bribes, and like that's how he got this. That's how he got the civil rights bills passed and the Medicare bill and everything. Was he convinced the right wing of his party to like he gave them just enough crumbs so that they would go ahead and vote for the bulk of the legislation and so on. And now they just back off. I mean, the most recent example might be the ACA under Obama and how Obama could have stuck to his guns and gotten a lot more, but he backed off even before the Republicans started pushing hard, on some of like the public option and stuff. And LBJ was a real good politician. I mean, he knew how to slap people around. He knew how to make them feel good, drink a bottle of whiskey with them, tell them their wife was beautiful, whatever kind of bullshit he had to hand out. He knew how to play that game because he was just one of those kind of like Will Rogers kind of guys. You know what I mean? I mean, that was his public persona anyhow. So
There's a Robert Caro interview. I'm gonna try and see if I can. I just literally just made this clip. I can't believe I'm blanking on the guy's name right now. I think his name's Skip. Um, Hold on. Oh yeah, Scoop Jackson.
oh yeah, yeah, Henry Scoop Jackson, the original neocon. Yeah,
Yeah, Robert Caro mentioned something that Scoop Jackson had said on LBJ and JFK, and he stated that when he went to JFK of like a press briefing, or he went to JFK on a press briefing, JFK would give him like a proposed thing, and then if Scoop Jackson replied that sorry we can't do that because of this and this and this, JFK would just say okay, thank you for the time, and then it would just kind of be done. Johnson was not so easy. Johnson would threaten you. He would coax you. He would do everything he possibly can, act like your friend, and do so many things just to make you open up to the point where you did what Johnson wanted done. And again, that's a good politician for civil rights for sure, whether he agreed with it or not. And he was just doing it for a legacy point for Kennedy or for himself.
and to get the black vote because he knew eventually that African American people were going to start be able to vote across the country
Again, I've
without
talked
any
to Martin
hassles.
Luther
Yeah,
King historians and other people, and they don't mind LBJ as much as people who are in JFK books talk about how much they hate LBJ. So again, it's different administrations, different times. People they're people. They have good and bads. But when you listen to things like I'm listening to interviews of either George Reedy. Let's take Malcolm Kilduff, for instance, the press secretary who was there in Dallas when JFK was shot in a press car. also was kind of very close to LBJ through his administration as well too. He made a statement you've actually answered for me that I didn't know what the statement was about, but he talked about the cars and the press pool and everything that was going through Dallas. And he's like, "Oh, they're supplied by Ford Motor Company." And the interviewer just goes, "They weren't supplied by Robert McNamara." And then they all both laughed and they never explained that point. So I
Yeah,
thought that was
that's
pretty
interesting.
funny.
Yeah, yeah.
But Malcolm Kilduff had talked about dealing with certain things when it came to LBJ and when it came to dealing with JFK. And when he was overall talking about the administration of Johnson, and long everyone believes, and I kind of stated it earlier, that Johnson was trying to pull in the Kennedy people. Malcolm Kilduff goes, he didn't want the Kennedy people. He was hoping that they would all just eventually give up, and a lot of them did give up and just quit out of the administration. Johnson wanted his own people in there, the people that he knew, and the people that supported him from the beginning to not have any influence because he was already being compared to Kennedy as it was. Again, he kind of popped out at the end of it more opposite of Kennedy. But there's these interviews that you get with certain individuals that you don't hear out of the history books when it comes to Vietnam. And I feel like you hear interviews with Dean Rusk, you hear interviews with Robert McNamara, you hear interviews with all these individuals. You learn more about what was going on and how things were being played and manipulated and worked. Where you start going, I think Vietnam in the history books is largely just misunderstood. And I don't think it's being taught properly. I get the whole basic points of like what we explained in the beginning, but overall the context of the times, we never met these individuals. We don't know what they were like in their free time. We don't know what they did, what they thought about, what was their daily confessionals. Luckily, we have a lot of transcripts and we have a lot of diary entries and things like this that kind of illuminate some things. But it overall opens up the whole story of Vietnam to wonder who else should be at fault here? Who else do we put on the list of things that really we should be blaming and teaching when it came to just how this could have gotten to such disastrous proportions?
I think one element of U.S. political society, culture, structure that gets left out a lot is the media, because everybody thinks, oh, the media was always against the war. They always supported the protesters and so on. When if you look at the media was one of the biggest cheerleaders for the wars, and they were the ones that told the lies for the most part. I mean, the first time people had a glimpse of what was going on was, I believe it was Morley Safer, and he was working for CBS. And you've probably seen the clip because you're pretty well versed. Um, was when he was over in Vietnam and he was on patrol with like I don't know military sizes with a squad or a platoon, I don't know, but it's a famous picture of them taking the Zippo lighters and torching the huts and rounding up all the people and everything. And after that happened, CBS ran it, but they didn't run much more like that because the Pentagon clamped down. But I think but as a general rule, the media supported the war. They supported the continued escalation. The Washington Post, I remember reading their editorials and talking. They were talking about we just, a few more, 100,000 more troops, we can do it. Da 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 da. And the Post and the New York Times were liberal newspapers. Imagine the more conservative papers, which is probably, even though there was a hell of a lot more papers in the United States back then, and the television media was pretty much three networks. It wasn't all the other. It wasn't like it is today.
Well, examine like the whole counterculture movement. They were being reported on as being stupid kids that were just immature and ignorant and didn't know what they were talking about when they were protesting, when really they were just noticing things that a lot of people weren't discussing. I mean, the main point for the media was to always support the government line on things because you need to have patriotic duty to your country. It was a bad thing to see that you would be falling to communism if you weren't supporting whatever president was going on. You might have had your differences, like there was the Connolly Yarborough differences, there was the whole split between different parts of factions of the parties and things of that sort. But now media is completely different. I mean, we hear criticism of certain governments and involvement in wars and things of that sort, but only if it's not that network's president. You hear it if it's like CNN supporting whoever or being critical on Trump, and then you hear Fox being supportive of Trump and then critical on Biden. It's like, just because it's your guy doesn't mean you need to do everything to show that he's the best possible thing or he's not as bad as the other guy. I want to know the critical parts of media, and this is where the counterculture movement really played an impact here. They were the only ones that were really reporting on police brutalities and things that were going on. Like, for instance, take Chicago. Was Chicago reporting the death of Fred Hampton? Was it talking about Fred Hampton being massacred in his home, shot twice in his head while officers were walking into his home with their own weapons that they were able to bring from home, not police issued or standard guns? 126 shots fired in the building, and only one of those shots was attributed to the Black
Was going
Panthers.
through the door the other way. Yep,
So
yep.
it's like you get to this point. Did media report on that? No, it was Black Panthers fought against police officers.
Yeah,
What?
it
What
was
did? What?
they kept. Yep, yep.
Why did a documentary of a home movie that was filmed about Fred Hampton and half of it had to go through his home and show all the bullet holes and all the massacre of Fred Hampton, blood on the floor and everything like that, and all these graphic things had to be shown and put out there as a news piece, basically? But it was a public service by the people of remembering the legacy and what these police officers were doing. We never had media that didn't support the city, the town, the state, the government, anything like that until all of this stuff after Watergate. Then everyone was like, what the hell are you doing? Photos of Vietnam coming back. What is going on over there? That was a turning point for society. The counterculture press only amplified that.
Yes, I think a key point in the way Middle America saw Vietnam was when the massacre at My Lai was finally
My Lai Massacre.
published, like about a year after it happened or something like that. And that was due basically to the doggedness of a couple GIs who were over there. The one guy, he was a military photographer, and he kept a separate. Back in those days, it wasn't digital, so he had his negatives, and he was supposed to turn all of his negatives over to his commanding officer, because then the military censored them, what went out to the main media and so on. But he had some of his own personal rolls of film instead of the ones that he had been issued at the beginning of the day by the supply sergeant or whatever. And so but it still took him several months to find a newspaper that was willing to print them, because he tried the big papers like the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, et cetera, and none of them were willing to risk their coziness with the administration and other people in power. So ultimately, it was like the Cleveland Plain Dealer or some smaller city paper that or even one smaller than that, but it was somewhere in Ohio, maybe his hometown, that ultimately published them. And then they got picked up by more and more people and the more and more media until they became the big splash. And what I remember most about My Lai when it came out was being appalled, of course, but then hearing people who at first denied it happened, because there had been rumors about it that the war was a lot of atrocities and stuff, and then saying, well, they deserved it. Some of them were Viet Cong, even though the facts were none of them were Viet Cong. They might have supported the Viet Cong, but that's not, because the Viet Cong were giving them food and helping them protect their village from the invader troops or whatever. But it was interesting how that happened. Just like people who could not change sides for whatever and say the war was wrong, they ended up defending more and more grotesqueries, as the war became more violent and more obviously pointless.
Well, look at Donald DeFreeze and the Patty Hearst kidnapping.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a real situation where a guy kidnapped a girl, a rich girl, and tried to hold her for ransom, or was it a white girl that was sleeping with a black guy, got found out about it, and didn't want to take the blame for it or be looked at or cut off by her parents, and just blamed it all on the one guy? I mean, how was it the fact that when Donald DeFreeze is in prison, she's still visiting him after the fact? Why is she visiting him if she was kidnapped? It makes no sense, yet it's not reported on.
There's that whole setup about that, like Donald DeFreeze, according to the Black Panthers and a couple of independent private investigative agencies that had followed his career from when he worked with Louis Tackwood down in the LAPD and their Red Squad units and their undercover units. And he was like a paid snitch, basically. Donald DeFreeze was Sinku. And why was it that he was able to escape from Vacaville? Like, he just walked out the door of the laundry and ended up in Berkeley with the SLA. So I think that was the SLA. This is my opinion, and who knows, but I think the SLA was composed of some of the people in that group were honestly wanted to be revolutionaries and adopted that all that kind of stuff and wanted to work with and they believed in the politics that the group espoused. But I think there were a couple other people that were agents of the police or and I think DeFreeze was one of them. I mean, I've never believed that he was a genuine person, and maybe as time went on, and that's he became more convinced. But I honestly think he was just a guy that was his latest hustle. You know,
I mean, look, take for example, we mentioned something about all the newspapers being supportive and not really talking about badly about the Vietnam War or any of the incidents like with Fred Hampton or stuff like that. You had the guy who owned K-Box also owned the Washington Post, who also was in the CIA in the 50s or OSS, working with David Atlee Phillips, who was a main propagandist for the CIA, is what he's well known for, was starting up newspapers in other countries and running propaganda stuff to try and convince the people to overthrow their own government so they can bring a democracy over there, their form of democracy. Then you have things like, what is it, Life magazine, the head person of that being influenced largely by certain individuals involved in the government, like J. Edgar Hoover. You had Jeremiah O'Leary of the Washington Star, who was a plant and leak for the FBI. Particular Hoover, he was getting stories about the FBI where people were reading it, like Ramsey Clark and LBJ, for instance. They wanted Hoover to testify to the Warren Commission. Everything's going to boil back to the FBI report. Hoover did it in 2 days. That's how the main conclusion of the Warren Commission is just the FBI report. But they had to do this giant thing to make everybody see that it was actually an investigation when really Hoover was just insulted that his report was not enough. So they asked him, can you testify to the Warren Commission? He stated, like, he was upset with it. Then later, he has to give testimony to the Warren Commission. And when it's released or when he testifies, LBJ was going to have it hidden forever. He never wanted that released. He was just doing it because to say, yeah, Hoover gave testimony, and they'll just lock it up for however long. Well, Hoover got so pissed off, he ended up giving it to Jeremiah O'Leary of the Washington Star and having Jeremiah O'Leary leak it. That became a phone call with Ramsey Clark and LBJ where they're like, Jeremiah O'Leary from the Washington Star leaked it. And he goes, how the hell did he get that information? And he goes, we think Hoover gave it to him. And it's just like, oh, yeah, you see how Hoover's like, you guys really want to play this game with me? You don't think my FBI is enough? It's these individual heads of power that have been so involved in their own worlds for so long, and they start colliding. And the best times of when you see it start working together is when they're not trying to piss each other off. And again, kind of going it back here, the only independent ones we had, like Ronnie Duggar of the Texas Observer.
Yep.
His very first article about the whole shooting of JFK is exactly probably the most accurate version of what we've all kind of combed together and got to now. It's the best statement about how the Warren Commission's a farce. It's all this, and this was all in 1964. So it's not like he had years to write about it and all this stuff to come out. He was already calling it then, but that was just a Texas newspaper. It was not anything that was popularized and glorified out there. But again, you had independent magazines, and bringing it back to the counterculture press, people were trying their hardest to get a message out there if they had the power to do so. The issue is where those people targeted. A lot of people have been talked about that, like, this happened. I think APEC had a couple of stories where he was followed by police for writing something, and then he was beaten, or a brick was thrown through a window and stuff like that sort. So, he was involved in the Chicago Seed.
Right. Yeah, he was the founder of it. Yeah,
it's a very good magazine. One of the ones that get mentioned with the counterculture press.
Yeah, it had pretty good journalism. Yep. Yeah. I had friends who ran a newspaper out of the it was called the Washington Area Spark, and they lived in the DC area, and they had been college. Some of them were college students at University of Maryland, and others were graduates and like bus drivers, for the Metro and stuff like that. But they put together this paper that was mostly left-wing politics, labor stuff, civil rights stuff, freedom fighter stuff, and then stuff about police brutality. Just recently, one of the guys who was he was pretty much the main editor of the paper, even though they operated as a collective. He runs a website on Flickr that has a bunch of their articles and thousands and thousands of photographs from that time period, from that area. He finally got some stuff from his FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, and it talked about how they were following various writers from that newspaper around, and that newspaper only had coverage in the DC area. It wasn't a big, and so he said, yeah, we always figured that person was FBI, That's why we didn't talk about certain things when they were around and so on. But a lot of people had no clue, and a lot of times the FBI was in there to provoke. I mean, the agent provocateur kind of stuff.
Well, there
You were
was
speaking
it
of
was a point where there was a lot of hardliners like your dad was with the military, where there wasn't anything but supporting the military. Not just because they were ignorant or they didn't want to know. It was just that it was never shown. It took so long for people to finally change, and even then, it was hard for them to do so. You're hearing a lot of things about you're an adult looking at a kid who's protesting something. That's a lot of what kids do. I see so many of my friends, even way people way younger than me. I'm not old. I would consider myself an old soul, but probably not. I just know a lot about history, and I'm kind of looking at people, and they're talking about this and this and this is horrible. This is horrible. I'm like, it's happened before. Like this is something that just changes the time period. And they're talking about no, it's not. You got to get it. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing this? I'm like, I understand your point, but there's a proper way to handle this. It doesn't always have to resort down to violence or doing things of this sort because it gets us nowhere. If anything, it turns people off from your movement. So you get into these kind of sections and you look back, what were the older people looking back? I hear so many of my friends who are a little bit older than me, probably like in their 40s, and they're talking about that their dad served in Vietnam, was never the same. That's why they hate LBJ. Me, I had my grandfather serve. I didn't know much about it because he never talked about it. So now I'm looking at the whole thing and I'm understanding why he was so traumatized and scarred, but I never heard him badmouth LBJ. I never heard him badmouth the country. We were a Coca-Cola family because Coke sponsored the Vietnam war effort.
right. Oh yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so again, it was just something that was a little bit different, and everyone's going to have their own takes on who's responsible in Vietnam or what was the main fault of things. I guess I would just kind of bring it back to the counterculture movement thing. What officially do you think when it came to the Vietnam War, and I think you've already said it already, but came to bring the Vietnam War to a close? Obviously, us finally getting out of there. Do you think that was largely responsible because of the counterculture movement? And again, it could be multifactorial.
I think that beyond the Vietnamese independence forces and the North Vietnamese. Um, but in terms, and I believe that it was very important, the anti-war movement slash counterculture. But I think perhaps the most important part of that um, was the veterans who began coming going out against the war and making the military was beginning to become unruly. You couldn't rule it. I mean, I lived on military bases until I was 18 or real close to them, and I just remember um, GIs. I hung out with a lot of GIs in high school because they were only a couple of years older than me and stuff like that. And we all liked the same music. We like to get high. We like the same girls and stuff like that. I think that was probably the most important when the anti-war movement moved to Vietnam itself, and GIs were just either actively protesting it or just not not participating. You know, I mean, the sad part, the tragic part about that is the way that a lot of them were not participating was they were becoming addicted to various substances that were free and easy to get over there, and probably pushed by who knows how much of that heroin that GIs got hooked on over there was actually heroin that was being sold through the CIA, just because the CIA was so involved in the whole heroin trade between Laos and the United States, kind of like the Iran Contra stuff and the cocaine coming out of Central America 20 years later. But I think that without the movement against the war and all the ways that it manifested itself, whether it was hardcore anti-war people or weather underground bombers or hardcore anti-war people always out on the street, carrying their pictures of Chairman Mao or whatever, and protesting the war, like fighting with the police and like living their politics 24/7, or if it was the people who just kind of like said, no, screw this war. This war is stupid. I'm listening to Creedence Clearwater. They're against the war. Grateful Dead are playing anti-war stuff. Even Motown's putting out anti-war songs. And so people just kind of said, no, I think the fact that they just said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. I think that made a big difference. And I think finally the people in power through the media, as the media started to turn too, because the media was closer to the ground. I mean, they were going to listen more to the civilian population than the military was, because the military does what it does, and they tend to isolate themselves from the civilian population. The longer they're, especially the men and women, well, nowadays women too, who have been in it their entire adult life, they really don't have an idea what it's like in the civilian world because they live totally within the military sphere, you know. But I think that without the counterculture and its various manifestations, um, that it would that the war probably would, who knows, it could have gone on for another 10 years, and and maybe just ended up in a weird kind of stalemate like what happened in Iraq or Afghanistan, where nothing really changed, just a lot of people died and a lot of land got destroyed and poisoned and so on.
What do you think would be the takeaway besides who's responsible for the Vietnam War? What would you say the takeaway of the Vietnam War is for anyone out there that was kind of just trying to find a better way to understand not just the impact that it had, but really just what do we say when we say Vietnam?
I think it was the last war that that the United States honestly thought it could win. And every other war that they've fought since then has been not necessarily to win, but to keep things at bay and to keep whoever the government has decided is going to be their enemy at a distance. Also, I think that and I think this is changing for the worse, but I think it's created a lot of among certain American citizens and residents. It's created a perennial distrust of any politician who or military person who says we need to go fight a war. And and that's not specific to a political party. I mean, we can see that like in today's world, where right now pretty much every politician in Washington supports what the US is doing to support Israel's slaughter in Palestine. But you look at Ukraine, and the majority of the people who are against the US army in Ukraine are in the Republican Party. And the Republican Party up since God, since Korea probably have been a consistently pro-war party. And the Democrats are always identified as a anti-war party, but they're not. They've only been against a couple wars. For the most part, they've always figured out a way, the majority of them, to support whatever war it is. They just might say, well, let's don't send troops. Let's just send more money and hire mercenaries or whatever. But I think the main thing is among the U.S. population, it's created a sizable minority who questions the need for war and understands that war is mostly about making money for certain elements of the economy. Certain. I think that's the thing to draw away,
I agree.
essentially.
Also that, and I would just say, look at way more than LBJ when it comes to Vietnam.
Yeah.
There's some names out there I need to start doing a deep dive on. Jack Valenti, Walter Jenkins,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
other
Interesting.
individuals,
Yeah.
even Kenny O'Donnell. I've heard a lot of good things about him, but I also know some people that really find him suspicious on some things. He left in the Kennedy administration in the Johnson administration, like not too long after it started, because he's just so broken up about Kennedy. But there's just a lot of people that I feel like knew something about something that was going on, like just backdoor type stuff that was never discussed on the phone. Abe Fortas is another one. He's got more phone calls with LBJ that are untranscribable because the audio tape just starts like it sounds clear, but then it just starts going and it's like
So they
really
scrambled it or something. Yeah.
yeah. So like even with LBJ, he had this I guess smartness to turn on his TV and would talk about private things, whisper really low on the phone, and have the TV blaring in the background. So you're hearing like little bits and pieces. You hear Vietnam, and then it's a sentence later, and you hear something else get mentioned. So again, they knew somewhat of what they were doing when it came to certain things, and I think a lot of this types of stuff is that what if we would have won Vietnam would have been looked at in a completely different way. I don't know. But that's not what happened. What happened was a disaster, and a lot of people had lost generations of family members. So we examine the Vietnam War. It should be something to be talked about, and it should be something that we should try and look at all aspects of the historical record. Like I said, changing opinions based on people from different parts of the administrations. You see people either evolve or devolve, and your opinion of them starts to change when you look at more of the context outside of one event or one scenario, what they did later on or what they did earlier. Ron, I always appreciate our conversations that we have. We tend to go all over. I love it. It's kind of the point of the show. That's why I call it conversation. I always appreciate having you on. I think you've been on multiple times now. I hope anybody listening will go look at Ron's past episodes. And also, Ron, can you please let people know where they can find any of your links, where your books are, and where you write at as well too?
Okay. Counterpunch is counterpunch.org. It's very, very easy. It comes out 5 days a week. The Friday edition is a weekend edition, so there's usually like, you know, 3, 4 dozen articles, and it's everything from reviews to commentary to poetry to hardcore news reportage from a perspective that isn't going to be found in most mainstream newspapers or on the television. Um, my books can be found, the easiest way is to go to bookshop.org and just type up my name. And if you use Amazon, they're on Amazon. Um, also, I want to mention a book that it's on the Vietnam War. It was written by a woman who was a Vietnamese refugee. She was very young when she came to the United States, and I believe it's called The Vietnamese War for Peace. Also, I'll send you the link to it, Robbie, so that way you can take a look at it. It might be somebody you want to get on your show. It gives a very good perspective, and she talks about the political war as the Vietnamese saw it, and that really incorporates the worldwide movement against the war. And she brings that in about how that influenced the peace talks, how it influenced decisions by the North Vietnamese government, by the U.S. government, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very deep look into that part of the war and how it was conducted.
My only recommendation is The Five People You Meet in Heaven. It's a great movie.
Oh yeah,
A
yeah.
portion of that does focus on the Vietnam War, about the
Oh,
guy's earlier parts of his life, and it's played by Angelina Jolie's dad. So
oh, that's cool. I didn't
yeah,
realize that.
it was
Oh, yeah. Oh,
the guy who plays in National Treasure, who plays Nick Cage's dad in the movie. That's Angelina
sure.
Jolie's
Yeah.
dad.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah. Me either. Yeah. Yeah.
Weird little add on at the end, but thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. You can check the description of this episode to be able to find any of Ron's links that he had mentioned here. And stay tuned for our next episode.